For me, growing up in the hills of East Tennessee was one of the greatest blessings I could have ever had in life. And there was nothing better than walking down that dusty road to my Granny Tollett's house and listening to her tell a story. And over the last few years, I've told many of her stories and people keep asking for more. So here we go with another episode of the master storyteller, Granny Tollett. I remember it now, Granny Tollett began as I took a seat next to her on the front porch. I remember it just as clear as day. It was as fine a June morning in East Tennessee as you ever saw. The kind where the sun lays a soft gold blanket over the hills and the air so full of honeysuckle and clover that you'd swear the Lord himself was breathing sweetness into the world. I was sitting on my porch just like now, rocking in this same old split-bottomed chair. As I recall, my hands were busy as bees, shelling a mess of black-eyed peas as I held the wash tub balanced on a stool betwixt my knees. And that's when I seen young Ellie May Turner coming up the big road, with her bonnet swinging in her hand and her face set like she was carrying a load heavier than a sack of meal. I said, "Well, law, child, come on up and set a spell." And I waved her towards the porch. "There ain't no need to walk that fast in this heat. Grab a chair by the door and let the breeze cool you off." Now, Ellie Mae gave me a small smile, but I could see in her eyes that they held waves of trouble, just like a pond after a rock's been tossed in it. Now, Ellie Mae was a slip of a girl, no more than 19 years old, with hair the color of ripe wheat and a spirit that could spark like flint when she was all riled up. She'd been coming to my porch since she was knee-high, about like you, JD, always asking for a story or a bit of advice. And I reckon I loved that gal near as much as my own kin. And I said to her, "Well, honey, what's got you looking like you lost your best hen, Ellie Mae?" as I pushed the wash tub towards her so she could help out with the peas. Well, she took a handful and held them between her fingers, and they was moving quick all right, but I could see her heart wasn't in it. For a minute, she didn't say nothing. She just sat there splitting the hulls with a snap that sounded like her thoughts were breaking too. She finally said,
"I'm in a fix, and I don't know what's right to do. It's about Amos Jenkins, and it's something that I ain't proud of."
Well, child, I leaned back in my rocker, and I just studied her face. You see, Amos Jenkins was a young fella from down by Kittle Creek, handsome as the devil in a Sunday suit, but he had a streak of meanness in him that always showed up in sharp words and a tight fist. Well, he'd been courting Ellie Mae for nigh on a year, and folks were already whispering about a wedding come fall. But I'd seen the way Amos looked at his money, like it was his firstborn child. And I'd heard tell of how he shamed Ellie Mae in front of all the church folks for spending a nickel on a ribbon for her bonnet. But I didn't say nothing about it. Instead, I just said, "Well, go home, child. Tell me what's weighing on your mind." Ellie Mae took a deep breath, like she was drawing a breath of courage.
"Miss Tollett, last week, down at the church quilting bee, we was working on the Big Star quilt for the missionary fund. You know how we'd been saving up for it, stitch by stitch, to send over to the folks in Rome County who were affected by the floods from the big tide that came last spring. Well, Amos came by to fetch me home, and he seen the quilt, all laid out pretty on the frame, with those bright calico patches we'd been collecting from everyone's scrap bags. Well, he got to talking about how much that quilt would fetch down at the county fair, and how it might bring in enough to buy a new plow, or maybe even a heifer. But Miss Tollett, I told him it wasn't for sale, and that it was for the Lord's work, and he just laughed at me and said,
"The Lord don't need no quilt, Ellie Mae. We do." But just then, Ellie Mae paused with her hands full of peas, and then she continued,
"Well, that night, after everyone was gone, I went back to the church to fetch my coat that I'd left behind, and there was the quilt, all folded up on the table. And Miss Tollett, I don't know what come over me, but I took it. I wrapped it in my coat, and I carried it home, thinking I'd hide it in my trunk till I could figure out what to do. Now, Amos didn't know I took it, but he's been talking about selling it ever since, and I'm afraid he'll find it and do just that. I haven't slept a single wink, Miss Tollett, and my heart's been pounding like a hammer on an anvil. I know it was wrong, but I was so mad at Amos for making light of the Lord's work, and I thought maybe if I took it, I could keep it safe. Now, I don't know how to make it right without losing Amos or shaming myself in front of the whole church.
As I was listening to her, I let out a long breath, the kind that comes when you hear a story that's got more knots in it than a pile of yarn. "Oh, Ellie Mae," I said, "you've gone and tangled yourself up good, ain't you, gal? But don't you fret too hard. The Lord's seen a lot worse messes than this, and He's got a way of untying knots if you let Him. Let me tell you a story, child, about a woman who got herself in a fix that's not all too different than yours." Well, Ellie Mae's eyes widened, and she leaned forward, forgetting about those peas, while I settled back and started rocking and let the rhythm of my rocker carry me into the tale, just like I'd always done when a storytelling took hold. Well, it was when I was a young wife, not much older than you. The women's ministry down at the Harmony Chapel Baptist Church was putting together a basket of goods for a widow down by Emory Valley. Her name was Martha Cole, and she'd lost her husband to a fever the winter before, leaving her with 3 little ones and not a penny to her name. Well, all us women folk in the church chipped in all our egg money just to buy her some flour and a jar of preserves and a bit of bacon, and we all sewed up a pile of clothes for her children. I recollect how proud we was of that basket, sitting there in the church sanctuary, all ready to be delivered come Sunday. Well, there was a gal in our group, Liza Jane, and she was sweet as honey, but she had a temper that would flare up like a brush fire. She was engaged to a fella named Tom Brody, a blacksmith who had a heart that was mostly good, but he had a way of pinching pennies until they squealed. Well, Liza Jane had been saving up her egg money for months to buy a new wedding dress, and she'd finally gotten enough to order a bolt of pretty blue cloth from Jenkins' General Store. But Tom, when he got wind of it, he told her she ought to spend her money on something more practical, like a new kettle or a set of tin plates for their new home. Well, I tell you right now, Liza Jane was fit to be tied, but she loved Tom, so she kept her peace. Well, anyhow, the day before we was set to deliver that basket to Martha Cole, Liza Jane was helping pack it up when she saw a pair of children's shoes in that basket that we had made from soft leather, just the right size for Martha's youngest child. They was a gift from Miss Petty, who'd cut 'em from her late husband's best coat, and they were finer than anything Liza Jane's own young'uns were ever likely to wear. Well, something snapped in her, I reckon, 'cause child, she took them shoes out of the basket when nobody was looking and slipped them into her apron pocket. She told herself that she'd give them to her little sister, who needed those shoes just as bad. But deep down, she knew it was wrong, plain and simple. Maybe she had done it because Tom had shamed her for wanting that dress. But anyhow, come Sunday, when we went to deliver that basket to Martha Cole, she opened it up and started thanking us with her eyes all misty. But when she got to the bottom, she looked puzzled and she said, "Well, I thought there was going to be shoes for little Jimmy." And we just all looked at each other, knowing full well that those shoes had been there the day before. And Liza Jane's face went white as a sheet. Now, she didn't say a word, but I could see her hands trembling, and I knew right then that she had taken them. Even though I didn't say nothing, I just patted Martha's hand and said we'd find another pair, which we did, though it wasn't nearly as fine. And wouldn't you know it, Liza Jane didn't come to church for 2 weeks after that. Folks thought she might have been under the weather, but I knew better. I went to see her one evening, and I found her sitting on her mama's porch, looking like she had aged 10 years. "Granny Tollett," she started out, "I've done something awful, and I can't live with it no more." And then she proceeded to tell me about taking those shoes and how she had hid them in her trunk, meaning to give them to her sister. But every time she looked at them, she saw Martha Cole's face and little Jimmy's bare feet. She said she'd been praying for forgiveness, but it hadn't come because she hadn't made it right. And I told her, "Child, the Lord don't forgive what you hide. You gotta bring it to the light, no matter how much it stings." And I reckon she knew I was right, because the next day she went to Martha Cole's cabin with the shoes in her hand and told her the whole story. And Martha, bless her heart, didn't say nary a harsh word. She just hugged Liza Jane and said, "I know what it's like to want something for your own, and I forgive you, and I reckon the Lord does too." Child, Liza Jane just cried like a baby, and from that day on, she was a different person, kinder and softer, just like the Lord had taken the hard edge off of her heart. But now, here's the funny part, Ellie Mae. When Tom Brody heard about what Liza Jane had done, instead of getting mad, he was proud of her for owning up to it. He told her he'd been wrong to fuss about that dress, and he went to Jenkins' store himself and bought her all of that blue cloth. And they got married that fall in the prettiest wedding you ever saw. And I reckon they was as happy as a couple as I'd ever saw, because they'd learned to see the gold in each other, even when the clay was showing. Granny Tollett paused, letting the story settle over Ellie Mae like a quilt on a winter night. And Ellie's eyes were wet, but she was listening, and Granny could tell that her heart was working overtime. "What I'm saying, child," she went on, "is that you got a chance to make this right, just the same as Liza Jane did. That quilt ain't yours to keep, and it ain't Amos's to sell. It belongs to the Lord and them folks who lost everything in the flood. You take it back to church, quiet like if you can, or own up to it if you must. Either way, child, don't let shame keep you from doing what's right. And for Amos, well, you gotta decide if he's the kind of man who'll love you for doing right, or if he's the kind that'll hold it against you. And child, that's only a question you can answer. But I tell you this, a man who loves money more than he loves mercy ain't fit to hold a woman's heart." Ellie Mae nodded. Her lips were so tight, but I could see a spark of courage in her eyes. "Well, what if I take it back and somebody finds out?" she whispered. "What if they turn me out of the church?" I reached over and I patted her hand. "Child, church folks ain't perfect, but they know a thing or two about forgiveness. You tell them the truth, and they'll rally around you the same as they did for Ellie Mae for taking those shoes. And if they don't, you hold your head high and remember that the Lord sees the good in you, even when you stumble."
Nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee, even though it be a cross that raiseth me.
Well, anyway, Ellie Mae didn't say much after that. She just helped me carry the wash tub into the kitchen, but I could tell her mind was working over what I'd said. The next Sunday, I was sitting in church, waiting on the choir to start singing, when I saw Ellie Mae slip through the side door with her coat wrapped around something tight and bulky. Now, she didn't look at anybody. She just went straight to the pulpit. And child, she laid that star quilt right back on the table, smoothing it out like it was a precious thing. I reckon nobody else noticed it, but I saw the way her shoulders straightened, like she had set down a heavy load. And once the choir started up singing, there was Ellie Mae, a-singing just as pretty and clear, and I knew right then that she had found her peace. After the service, I heard Sally Ann whispering to the other women that the quilt had miraculously reappeared, and they was all laughing about how the Lord works in mysterious ways. Well, that evening, as I was walking home, the pennyroyal along the road was brushing up against my skirt, so I stopped to pick a sprig, and I crushed it in my hands. Child, the scent took me back to my own girlhood, back to the days when I was learning the hard lessons of life and love. And I thought about Ellie Mae and Liza Jane and all the women that I'd known who had stumbled but managed to get back up with their hearts a little wiser for it. In that moment, Granny Tollett snapped back to the present, only to realize that she had finished shelling the beans. JD, look at me just rambling away when there's plenty more chores to be done. Now go on, son, grab yourself a slice of pie out of the kitchen and let me get back to work. As I walked into the house, I took one last look back and saw the smile on Granny's face. She loved nothing more than to share a story from long ago.